And Putin, of course, he was calling for to be tried as a war criminal, which he continues to do. It looks as though he's had a very good point with what's been revealed in Bucha.
Well, I wasn't deriding him for what it's worth, because even before the horror that we're seeing coming out of Bucha, and that we will see in other towns near Kyiv, we had substantial evidence of indiscriminate killing of civilians by Russians, such as the killing of hundreds in Mariupol, many of whom are still buried under a theater that was destroyed by Russian shelling. The only question was really whether Vladimir Putin had ordered such attacks or set up a system for such attacks where civilians were targets on a daily basis, a war crime. What we're seeing in Bucha is that clearly hundreds of people were killed and buried. We have evidence that some of them were executed simply because they had hands tied behind their backs. And we have a series of witness statements that testify to that. And as the evidence is accumulated in a formal way, and as this is done, as I said, in other areas of Kyiv, certainly from a legal standpoint, I think there is a case that Vladimir Putin and military commanders could be tried for war crimes, in theory.
Professor, it's so easy after 7 weeks to not to become used to these horrors, but to just talk about it, and not suggesting you are, but, you know, we're naturally less shocked than we were when this all happened. And yet it's more important than ever now, isn't it, now that this evidence is there for the world to see, even though Russia is claiming that this was all set up and the satellites showing the complete opposite. Justice in these sorts of situations, they take an awfully long time. The ICC very unlikely to be able to try anyone anytime soon.
Well, let me say, first of all, that wherever we go with the investigation, never forget. I mean, this past weekend was the toughest for me covering a story since the killing of more than 1,400 people by a nerve agent attack outside Damascus by the Russian-backed Assad regime in 2013. And a month, a year, years from now, we shouldn't forget those who have been slain just because they were innocent, whether it was executions or in the heat of the moment. In terms of the practical points, look, I have to be honest with you. No leader who is still in power gets tried for war crimes. They would only get tried if they fall from power, whether by force of arms or their own people remove them. Think about Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia or Charles Taylor in Liberia. However, it is important that we collect the evidence, as was noted yesterday by the UN Human Rights Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, by European Union leaders like Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel, and by other international leaders. And why is it important? Even if Vladimir Putin never stands trial, the importance of establishing exactly what happened so that you clearly say that these people were innocent, that they were executed or killed indiscriminately. You set that up for future generations as a marker of that we do not forget, we do not let these war crimes go, even as you noted, when the leaders of a country which may have perpetrated those war crimes have gone on an all-out campaign to push out disinformation, to bury the truth, as well as the victims.
But, Scott, as to why it's being allowed to happen, how we've got in this position in the first place, the West's reaction to what is happening. In your role as a professor of international politics, we hear our Foreign Secretary talking about the West's dependence, why France does not respond harder, why Germany does not respond harder, and Liz Truss talks about the West's dependence on Russian oil and gas. Right. Britain, to a degree, they may say, well, we're not exactly the same. But I just put it to you, these people, who on earth thought it a good idea to let Putin have his hand on the gas tap? I mean, they sanctioned it all in the first place. What on earth was going through their heads?
Well, the president of Germany said yesterday, we were wrong. We made a mistake in pursuing Nord Stream 2 precisely to put ourselves in this position of dependence. And I agree with you that on the military as well as the economic fronts, that the international community, not just Germany, not just the UK, not just the US, was too slow, was too weak in reacting. But they have reacted now. Phase A of Russia's offensive has failed. They have killed civilians, but they have not occupied the territory. They have not toppled the government. They have not detained and killed the leaders, such as President Zelensky. And in part, that has been because of significant military and economic support to Kyiv. Now, the government would like more. They would like more assistance. They would like sanctions to come quicker. But we are having serious consideration of those steps. As you heard yesterday from Liz Truss, but more importantly from the German defense minister, the consideration now of a timetable for the embargo, or at least the sharp reduction of purchases of Russian oil and gas, that is now on the table. So if Russia insists on trying to seize territory now in the east and south of Ukraine, they will face further sanctions. And I think equally important, Ukraine, quite often quietly, will be getting significant military assistance to try to ensure that Putin doesn't try to claim a victory after, well, being a war criminal.
Not buying oil and gas, is that what Boris Johnson means by maximum sanctions?
That's one of the most significant steps you can take, because you're talking about billions of dollars that the Russians collect from oil and gas. And that combined with Russia being isolated, ostracized almost from the financial community, where they're finding it hard to trade, they're finding it hard to move their money around, not just the oligarchs, but the Russian system itself, that has a squeeze on the economy. Will it topple Vladimir Putin from power? Will it completely stop the Russian military? Not yet. But it does prevent Ukraine from falling into Russian hands. And it does put pressure onto Putin to start thinking about, look, do you really want to keep imposing these costs on your country? And if he doesn't decide that's the case, maybe the Russian people and other Russian leaders decide, it would be best to try to get back to the negotiating table rather than trying to kill our way into seizing part of this country.
Professor, just a final thought, about future generations and the importance to mark what's happening here. I just want to ask you, we heard yesterday the Polish foreign minister being very critical of President Macron specifically, asking him, would you have negotiated with Hitler for the way that he's handled Putin and all of this? I just wonder how you think history is going to judge the West's response. We also heard the UN Human Rights Council trying to get rid of Russia, but they haven't managed to. I mean, these are the sorts of things that future generations will be baffled by, isn't it?
Well, President Macron, who is facing an election in France within a few days, I'll let him speak to his grandstanding, both past and present. But I think it's right that we don't just look at Emmanuel Macron. This is a collective effort, and other leaders have been responsible. Other leaders have stepped up to the mark. In terms of how history will judge, history doesn't reach an endpoint. History travels along many paths. The importance right now is, rather than declaring we're at the end of one of those paths, to continue to mark what has happened, to collect the evidence of what has happened, to try to understand what has happened, and to not again, I will tell you, the Russians will go all out to deny their responsibility for what has happened, not only in Bucha, but elsewhere, to not let ourselves get distracted by the disinformation and chatter of social media from that collective responsibility, not just as leaders, but as responsible people in all countries, to say,
Lucas,
look,
thank you very
it shouldn't
much.
happen.
We've got to leave it there.